my dad's sweetie, prayer and exercise. And one of the resources that I was introduced to was Wiggles in Wonder, which is the Substack that Bird Treacy writes. And I continue to follow Bird's writing for the last 4 years. And so one of the things that I found deeply appealing is within Bird's writing, there was a clear awareness. It is not exclusively in this realm, but in regards to inclusion in a way that spoke to my heart. And so I really wanted to be able to have that discussed at the level of our parish. And so, Bird, I will hand it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, so as Liz said, I have been writing Wiggles and Wonder for the last 4 years or so now, which was also my panic response. I was at a very small parish at the time and really worried about parish access to resources from that perspective. But today I'm coming to you from my very conventional church job from my office in Chile, New England, where I am the children's programming coordinator at a small Episcopal church. And I took an unconventional route to get here. I came to real work in the church versus my engagement as a parishioner through landing at a church that had godly play many years ago when I was a student in a gender studies program in Atlanta. And so I was specializing in disability studies as a graduate student and have now found a way in my various professional capacities to bring together my deep love of Christian formation and my lived experience and intellectual background in the area of disability and disability studies. And so today I have a presentation and some space for conversation for us that is really about looking at disability in the biggest picture sense. And we had some back and forth as we were attempting to time this once upon a time that we hoped we might be able to do this talk during Disability Pride Month, but we have landed instead right on the cusp of the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, which is marked on December 3rd. So we are still very timely. I'm just going to pull up my presentation here. And we'll get started. There we go. So when I talk about disability in the context of the church, I really want to emphasize what it means to look at the topic from a really big picture point of view. And that means starting with a couple of key ideas and a real understanding of the typical context of disability in the life of the church. It's one thing that I have observed over a lifetime of being a church person is that overall churches do a relatively good job of thinking about physical access to spaces. And I think particularly in the shape many of our churches take now, we are aware, for example, that our Tuesday morning Bible study, for example, that is largely retired individuals, we probably don't want to put it in the basement and have folks trudging up and down the stairs. Like that might be a mobility issue. But we have no problem, for example, putting children's Sunday school programs in basements much of the time, disregarding both sort of the developmental challenges of that, but also the idea, for example, that children who have mobility disabilities might be part of our Sunday school spaces. Similarly, when we look at the shape of our altar spaces, it's often not possible for someone with mobility differences to access the altar. There's a sense of who belongs in the different sacred spaces of a church based on our physical access to them. And so that is one of the ways in which a sense of ableism, of bias around ability, marks our church environments. And we see sort of varying relationships to age and ability. The way in which we are used to adapting is largely shaped by a sense of being aging communities. Just being realistic about the nature of churches, as a young person in the church, that we build our spaces with the awareness that there aren't that many young people. And I say that as a multiply disabled young person in the church who was tromping up and down the stairs to one of my Sunday school classrooms today. Um, so we create spaces that really are built to our communities, but with a preconceived notion of who our communities are. And that includes a sense of bias towards the idea that disability might be tied to age and not other factors. And so we prioritize needs in that direction. So it's a failure to think about broader access. Um, Similarly, we think, for example, about audio amplification often, because with age comes diminished hearing. Yes, this is like a curb cut effect, which is something that we say when an access um, intervention or adaptation benefits a wider group of people than the people it was intended to support. So curb cuts allow wheelchair users to navigate public space, but they also are great for kids with scooters and parents with strollers. So things of that nature. But we think about audio amplification in a way that has a curb cutting effect without thinking, for example, about, someone with sensory differences. For example, as an autistic person, I don't always want things to be quite so loud. And my bin of sensory supplies that everyone has access to in my church includes ear defenders. So, organ too loud for you? We've got you covered. But that also comes with a sense of stigma and comes from a framework of having someone in the space who is considering that side of the equation, that there will be conflicting needs that we need to prioritize in any given space where people are. Like, this is not only true of the church, but it manifests in particular ways in the church. Now, another piece, what we're just doing here is laying some groundwork for some very particular conversations about disability in church contexts. So I really want to walk us through briefly the neurodiversity paradigm, this framework about the different ways in which people's minds work. Now, depending on what kinds of circles you operate in, you may hear the word neurodiversity a lot, or you may never hear it. Could go in either direction. But it is in many ways a wildly misused term. And so I always want to bring it into the circle to be cracked open and explored more carefully. So often people will use the word neurodiversity in spaces where they're asking a question, for example, about church access, as what they think of as a polite way of saying usually some combination of autism and ADHD. And that is the closed bubble in which that conversation tends to be happening. When really, we are all part of a neurodiverse community. Every kind of brain is part of that community, just like every person is part of a diverse community. We all contribute to that framework. When we talk about neurodivergence, however, as those whose brains operate differently, from what we think of as typical. Now, that's a much, much bigger category, container, than how it is often used. And so, yes, it includes those sort of standard bearers of conversation of autism and ADHD, but it also includes Down syndrome. It includes depression and anxiety. It includes all of the different ways that our minds work. So dyslexia falls under the neurodiversity paradigm, or the neurodivergent framework of that piece. Has a long, long list. Neurodegenerative conditions that affect one's physical body. So something like multiple sclerosis that hits the nervous system might fall under this bubble. Alzheimer's and dementia fall under the neurodivergent framework. So we really want to ensure that we're having these conversations with the fullness of what they contain so that we aren't offering up a category that someone belongs to. We aren't saying, oh, yes, neurodivergent individuals. And then when someone doesn't fall under the 2 or 3 conditions that we think are part of it, kind of pulling that back and saying, oh, no, not you. So just holding that particular fullness of that category. And one of the things that this framework and those who are working within a sort of neurodiverse affirming way of being, of fostering inclusion, it's a framework that has really been used to emphasize the difference between affirming differences and pushing for assimilation towards the norm. And so when we talk about something being neurodiversity affirming, it's about welcoming in all of those different ways in which we operate and engage with the world. And the other piece that I want to bring into the room before I give you an opportunity to digest a little bit of this with your neighbors is the notion of, I don't know why that doesn't have a picture, but the notion that disability is a political identity and in general is an identity writ large, that to be disabled is often so stigmatized that there's a sense of pulling away from it, of an anxiety about identifying with this label, but that we find solidarity in building community around disability as a way of being. And there are several different models of disability that inform our ability to do this. So what we are often taught to think about is the medical model of disability, that disability is a physical or otherwise a biological difference, and that it requires medical intervention, that it aims towards cure, that there is this very particular, there is something wrong and maybe medicine can fix it version of disabled existence. Then we have sort of a moral model, and this is really essential to thinking about disability as Christian communities because it is built into some of our questions around scripture. So the moral model is, oh, that person is disabled because they did something wrong. Like there is something fundamentally flawed about them. And so we think about the disciples saying to Jesus, who sinned, that man or his parents, that he is blind? Oh, no, Jesus said, that is not what is happening here. And so we see that turn away, even all the way back in the Gospels, from this moral model. And yet at the same time, when we think about frameworks like the idea of bad things happening to good people, like a lot of that is tied up in our own sense of, well, if I'm good enough, if I'm godly enough, if I say enough prayers, bad things won't happen to me or the bad things will be fixed. When really what we have turned to from a disability politics position is largely a social model of disability, which is complicated in that there are things that social modifications will not fix, but that disability is largely created, constructed by our environments. So the problem is not someone's inability to walk up the stairs. The problem is that there's not a ramp. The problem is not someone's inability to see. It is that there is not, a braille text available or audio, an audio device that will provide a digital reading of the text. Like the problem is not the individual and their embodiment, it is the surroundings. And so again, this is another distinction between affirming the ways in which we exist in the world or pushing for an invisibilization or an assimilation of those identities. And so, what leaning into disability as an identity does for those of us who find ourselves connected to that category is it allows us to create community and develop a sort of political and community consciousness around our ways of being. And I'm realizing that the image that is unfortunately missing from this slide is actually the disability pride flag, which it may come as a surprise that that is something that even exists. It is a series of different colored stripes, with each stripe representing a different category of disability, including physical disabilities, neurodivergence, invisible disabilities or undiagnosed disabilities, emotional and psychiatric disabilities, and sensory disabilities like blindness and audio processing disorder, or even lack of smell or taste. And it's against a Black background. And I want to share a little story about this, even though we can't see it. It's a sort of muted looking flag. Like the background is Black, but it's almost gray. The colors are in theory red, gold, white, blue, and green, but they're all like a little bit on the edge of pastel. And the reason for that is that someone created a flag and it was a Black background and it was bold and it was kind of lightning bolt shaped instead of being a diagonal stripe. And some people with disabilities that can be triggered by kinds of visual input, including certain types of epilepsy, for example, would find that when they saw this image on their phone, this image that was supposed to call them in, that actually it was triggering symptoms. And so the community came together and made modifications. They also changed the order of the stripes because it was hard to differentiate between, I think it was the green and the gold, if you had a particular kind of color blindness. It became a community project to ensure that we are drawing people in. And this is another place in which I want to call us to our Christian identity, that when we see the symbols of our faith, when we see the cross, when we see, the Lamb of God, when we see the symbols of the Eucharist, does that call people in? Or does it push them back to the margins? So really thinking about each piece of access and inclusion as a community process and project. And before I turn this to you for a little bit of conversation, I want to also provide one of my central addendums to this topic, which is anytime I find myself talking about disability in the church, I always make sure that I say that this is a topic that may cause you some anxiety. you may feel like there's a lot of traps almost. There are a lot of ways to get things wrong. And I want to say, yes, you're right. There are a lot of ways to get things wrong. But your anxiety, and this is the important part, your anxiety is an expression of your deep concern. And so it is better to try something and find that it is a misstep than to be caught up in that anxiety and not to make some sort of move towards change at all. So with these sort of broader disability identities at hand, with these new concepts fresh in your mind, I want to invite you to turn to a neighbor and consider if perhaps there is a place that you didn't realize you identified with disability. Or how might you be missing the concept of disability within your existing community? What does changing the way you're thinking about this label, about this identity, what does it change? Because naming is a powerful tool. And I can say from my own family's life, as someone who also has a disabled parent, that it took him a really long time to move from a place. My father has MS. He was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 1997. I would say he probably only came to a sense of disability identity sometime in the last 5 to 10 years, probably closer to 5. The man has not been able to walk particularly well independently for at least a decade. So really opening ourselves to the notion that this is not a bad thing. Just going to give you like 5 minutes to turn to a neighbor, and then we'll come back.
Don't have a neighbor. You can just be on
All right, I'm gonna start calling us back in.
Or good talkative person.
Yeah. No, that was perfect timing for my very old building's heat to bang for about 5 minutes.
Are you all ready to get back together? I know it's. But it's good to start the presentation and know it will continue. Okay, for
Yep. All right, great.
to give you a heads up, we have about 20 minutes left.
Beautiful. All right, well, we're gonna move into some very particular church strategies, and then I look forward to taking questions and thoughts and things that are percolating at the end. So let's think about, with all of this framing at hand, how we use that information to really open our church doors wider. To drop the S, you've even got a hymn title here. An all right one, open wide the doors. So one of the places that I always begin and that I find so rich in talking to parishes about how we ensure that we are inviting disabled individuals and their families into our church communities is through communication, and really starting with our websites. And this can feel kind of technical and boring, but it is a powerful tool simply to name a few aspects of your community's accessibility capacity. Like, where are there ramps? Where is there accessible parking? Are there sound amplification devices available? And to also be explicit about what you don't have or cannot do, to name if you are having a meeting in a space that has stairs and doesn't have an elevator that provides access to it. Just to be really explicit, and to know that even if you miss various particular needs and categories in naming what your accessibility factors are. For example, I am fairly sensitive to perfumes and scents. And so I don't tend to communicate about that, say, just when attending a church, although it helps me to know, for example, does your worship service use incense? Because maybe I don't want to attend that service because I enjoy breathing. Um, but, it's useful for me to know, oh, these are people who are naming access factors. So if I'm going to a special event and I think, something might be happening, or I would really like to attend this, but I'm, worried about perfumes. Is there a way for there to be, for example, a no or low scent seating area? And when you start naming things, what happens is people say, oh, they are aware that people's needs for a space and for a community and for an event are different. And so they will be open to my question. It invites people to reach out if they have concerns that go above and beyond what you have named. And so it isn't about naming absolutely everything. It's about inviting people to express their access needs. So the first piece then is, in what you write about your space online, in what you say when you greet people in worship, where your ushers point people to when they come through the doors. Those things are all part of how we communicate inclusion. Another piece of how we communicate inclusion in our church spaces is through how we behave collectively. And this has been one of my favorite topics, I think, to field questions about. Um, because I tend to think of, for example, someone talking about a family member or a friend who has a vocal tic, for example. Well, yes, that might be immediately understood as disruptive. And when we learn to acknowledge physical and behavioral differences as part of the background noise of our community, we can all learn to be non-responsive in a way that is inclusive versus non-responsive in a way that is exclusive. It's the difference between carrying on with the prayer and turning and staring at someone. The same is true, for example, if someone is attending worship and they have a feeding tube and the feeding tube pump starts beeping. It's the difference between looking around for the source of the noise and carrying on with the life of the community, because this is also just a part of that person's life. And these are learned practices and specific to different disabilities and different community needs. And it's also worth being aware that those of us who identified as disabled are usually not showing up to the places where we think we're going to cause the greatest amount of disruption. Like, I don't want to take a noisy medical device to the 4-person 8 a.m. spoken Eucharist at my church because there were 4 people at it this morning. That seems noisy. The 60 people with an organ at 10 o'clock, yeah, that seems fine. It'll fade into the background. So really know that the people coming to community are doing their best and doing our best in our own behavior to engage in a way that is about invitation rather than about sort of an anxious noticing and hesitancy. And again, this is about our own kind of community conditioning. Again, we've talked some about the specificity in what we name in our various communications, and that naming is an invitation. In the same way that naming disability can have a radical impact on how we understand ourselves and others and how we understand our communities, naming from the perspective of an institution and a community can be an invitation. Now, we're having a little bit of sensory strategy conversation as folks were coming in and settling down, talking about oh, yes, there's, coloring sheets available. And I loved that Liz said, I'm a fidgeter, and so I, want to support other people's needs. And this is pointing us towards my last bullet here, this no age limits piece of it all. So you will find when you walk into my church's sanctuary a little bin full of various supplies, and it just says, need support? Here's a list of the things that are available in this basket. Take anything you need, return it here at the end of worship. And so it's ear defenders, it's little Tangle fidget objects, it's liquid timers, um, all of these different objects that aim to touch on different sensory profiles, because that is one of the biggest determinants for all of us in terms of our ability to engage with, even the core rhythms of worship. So, do I have something to do with my hands? Am I feeling overwhelmed by the volume? Can I see the text? Like, we recently finally started offering large print hymns, for example, because we didn't have the resources to like photocopy them the right way. We had to buy a different hymnal. It was a process, but it's a piece of meeting the sensory needs of our community. Is, oh, it's hard for you to see what's in the hymnal. Here's a version that invites you into full participation because now you can read the hymn. And so meeting people's sensory needs across age groups and in a way that is about enabling engagement. This is a conversation that comes up a lot as a children's programming coordinator is, well, I have these things, but then, the kids are messing around with them. They're, playing instead of paying attention. And I always emphasize, A, that we are using whatever it is, whether it's a coloring page or some sort of object to hold, if it's an alternative seating option, we're using these as tools for helping people be present to whatever the activity is, rather than as a distraction. They are tools, they aren't toys or, something fun to experiment with. And I'm really particular in sort of my various setups about providing things that are bolstering the activity that we're all collectively engaged in. So when my kids came in from Sunday school this morning, because I'm a few hours ahead of you all, and they came in from Sunday school this morning and went up to the altar with one of my 7-year-olds. And we came back and she was working on a coloring page that was like a big design of the word hope. And I pointed her to the little piece of liturgy for the lighting of today's Advent candle and how it talked about hope. Oh, and here is the wooden Advent wreath that sits on the children's table. And, even if the adults want a coloring page, they're going to find things that correspond with what we're doing that day. I don't put like stress ball fidgets in my front children's worship area because I'm not going to equip them with something that they are going to throw in the air during the Eucharist. I'm going to put, for example, a liquid timer. We have a liquid timer full of gold glitter. You can feel the attention center when they flip it over in that space. And so across the lifespan, in all ways, we're looking for ways to enable people's engagement. That is what providing kind of adaptive resources in our environments does. I also want to speak very briefly to this one element that has been coming up in my work lately, which is the element of core strength and our ability to literally sit up and pay attention. Often, when we find that people are having a problem with attention, particularly children, it actually has to do with their physical ability to hold ourselves up and not have to pay a great deal of attention to our physical embodiment. And so I'm always kind of thinking about how do we provide simply the physical structure to secure that aspect of our sensory experience. Like, oh, I need something to lean on because my connective tissue is not doing its job. And if I want to use my brain to think about the sermon and not think about sitting up, then I'm going to need to be leaning on something. Just really thinking about what is happening internally as well as with those sort of more external senses. And then this is where the work of inclusion from a community perspective gets really fun. Finding your hook, finding the thing that allows you to help invite people in, because this is something that's available to all of us. So one piece of this is reimagining various resources that we already use in, for example, our church school environments. Some of this is really practical. So as a godly play trainer and teacher, I am really attuned to the particular materials of that program, which are a lot more tactile than many other, worksheet-based programs, for example. But oh, what if there were different tactile elements to the days of creation? What if I can feel the outline of the sun and the fish? What if we have, well, we already have our desert in our classroom. Well, what if there is some water available for an activity when we're talking about the ark and the flood? What if we are thinking about how to create a space in our worship areas for someone who needs to be able to move? You have someone who engages best when pacing. Well, how do I use what I already have? How do I be imaginative? And how do we provide everyone with meaningful roles in our communities? How do we, for example, expand the notion of who might be a lector, who might offer the readings or the prayers? Oh, well, how is it different if American Sign Language is the primary language of a reading, and the rest of us are following along in what is functionally a second language? What would it look like to invite a non-speaking individual who uses an adaptive communication device to offer a reading using their device? How would that be different? And what does it mean that that might be unsettling to some people? How do we interrogate that unsettledness and really look for the ability to provide meaningful roles to all members of our community to really tap into each individual's gifts? And that our hook is often as simple as the call to be good neighbors, to be the person who says, oh, yeah, this young person or wants to walk in and out of this particular door in the back corner. Mom, Dad, you take a break, go sit in your spot. I can worship back here and be their neighbor, be in accompaniment with this person. Um, oh, it's really hard for this longtime member of our morning prayer group to follow along with the text at this point. He can't really see very well, his dementia is advanced, but you know what? He can still lead us in the Lord's Prayer. So no matter what rotation we're using, that's going to be his anchoring role in our circle. Like, he remains fully present, fully part of a meaningful role in the community. And all of this is ultimately about flexibility. And we're not always really good about flexibility as churches. Like, I am, to be fair, in New England, where we are sometimes known as the frozen chosen in particular. But, staying flexible is really the heart of thinking through access and inclusion. It's about saying, what is the heart of what we're doing? And how do I stay true to the heart of what I'm doing without closing it down so that fewer people will have access to it? How do I crack it open? And finally, all of this is done through the framework of inclusion as a ministry partnership, that we are inviting others in, that we are always doing things with others and not for them. And so I always have to put in my Sunday school teacher spiel side, which is that means that we aren't putting, all of the children who are disabled in a parish into their own contained classroom instead of with their peers. We aren't cloistering people away. We are figuring out how to bring them into the circle. We all get to be part of the circle, and that remains true. And we can offer things that are specific while also ensuring that those offerings are tied to a much more radical inclusion. And so now what? What is feeling alive for you in these last few minutes that we are together?
Thoughts, reflections, shared?
One thing that being a volunteer for sure means to me is that remembering that an equal accommodation can be just as wonderful as an example is that there was a restaurant in Santa Fe that I couldn't get into. And they, without me prompting them, they came over to the table with a bowl and a bar of soap. And stood there while I was in. And it was just the dearest, warmest, and it was unadvocated for. And anybody can do that. And so that's sort of everybody's job to observe when somebody is uncomfortable or not, or whatever. And then see if there's something you can do about it. Never offensive in any way, at least to me, and then maybe I'm not, maybe somebody offers you. And I can advocate for myself. Yeah. So that's just my thing, is it's for everybody's job to accommodate, maybe without a permanent fix.
I'm just going to note that I'm like picking up parts of what people are saying, but it's crackly. So
Okay,
I may need some, yeah.
a quick summary. One of our parishioners, Bob, kindly was sharing that simply asking can be a way to show invitation to include. Is if you see somebody who may have a need, such as he was giving the example of being at a restaurant that didn't have access to the bathroom, so that they brought over the means for him to wash his hands, and that he really appreciated it because he didn't have to ask for it, he didn't have to advocate for it. They saw the need, they offered it, and he was able to then choose whether to use it or not.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for think about aging and how some of us don't have mobility issues in a large part of our adult life, and then we do. And for me, that's just a piece of this as well. And then you see folks who were pretty regular churchgoers, and then in terms of change in mobility, maybe, or hearing, or seeing, that we don't see them. And so I also, Bird, want to thank you for talking about divergency. I was saying to my small group here, Lori and Sally, that it's a word I see a lot, and it's a word I read about, but I've always felt like I don't really know the definition of it. And you really opened that up in a nice and simple way too. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, those are two of my particularly live topics. I always joke that my grandmother, my father, and I all started using canes in the same year. So a particular perspective on mobility. And yeah, you're in the majority, I think, on the question of what is neurodiversity and neurodivergence. So
Yes,
I wonder what you do with, you mentioned you had your father think that he wouldn't acknowledge any disability for a number of years. And I have a friend with MS who doesn't want to feel disabled and doesn't want to feel frustrated. So the approach to somebody who really has some disability but they don't want to acknowledge.
yeah. And isn't that when that offering, that invitation to at least the resources of access, because we can't push people towards naming these things before they're ready. It won't work. But we can still ensure that we are providing tools to support them along the way. And I think also, acknowledging the ways in which our own embodiment or, cognitive processes give us our own challenges helps to destigmatize that in a way that says, I am a safe person for you to grapple with this with, even if you're not there yet.
thank you for that. We are hitting the end of our time. It took some months to bring this to fruition because we are a busy parish. There's a lot of other demands. But one of the reasons I really wanted to have Bird present is because I wanted this to be the beginning of the conversation, not the end. She's presented Bird presented a number of things for us to mull over, wonder, question, and my hope is that we can, there's been fluxing in and out of here at most 15 to 18, 17, 16 of people that we can talk about it as with our friends and talk about it as a congregation, to have that conversation and kind of address what does that look like with where we are in our parish and where we are in our lives. Do you have any parting words, Bird?
I just want to thank you all for being willing to sit with this conversation. As I said before, there's a lot of anxiety around disability and access and inclusion, and always just to hold that piece that our anxiety is an expression of our care and to move from there.
Thank you. Yay. All right. Well, I'm going to take you off of the big screen and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.